Today we'll be talking about the evolution of one of the most iconic TV shows of all time, The Twilight Zone. For over 60 years, the popular anthology series has taken viewers on a journey into a wondrous land of imagination. Each iteration of the series explored everyday people who found themselves in unusual situations. From the classic TV series to Jordan Peele's Reboot and everything in between, I'll trace the origin of the show and the different forms it took along the way. Submitted for your approval, The Evolution of the Twilight Zone. The original Twilight Zone aired from 1959 through 1964. It lasted 5 seasons and had a total of 156 episodes. The landmark series was the brainchild of Rod Serling, a successful, prolific, and gifted writer. The original show featured Martians, robots, an evil doll, and time travel.
Press the button, my friend. Send me back into time.
But how did this unique series even come about? Well, it was actually born out of a very restrictive climate. Early on in his television career, Rod Serling, who was very outspoken when it came to social issues of the day, struggled with censorship. He'd butt heads with TV executives, sponsors, and pretty much everyone who took issue with him shedding light on controversial topics. He was labeled the angry young man. One notable example of Serling's writing that came under fire was his script for The Arena, which was a commentary on politics. That story was heavily altered and watered down. 2 other scripts that ended up getting massively changed were Noon on Doomsday and A Town Has Turned to Dust, both of which initially explored issues of racism and were inspired by the murder of Emmett Till. As a result of these barriers, Rod Serling figured out a loophole, a unique way to avoid the wrath of censorship.
You may have to tell them a story of prejudice in parable form. Now on Twilight Zone, for example, done during just as timorous a time as any other time, we made a comment on prejudice, on conformity, on intolerance, on censorship. Now it may well be that the inner message may never get through, but I think peripherally it does get through.
And so it went. Rod would use the world of sci-fi and fantasy to speak about the social issues of the day and comment on the human condition. The first pilot for The Twilight Zone was a story called The Time Element. William Bendix starred as a man who traveled back in time to December 6, 1941, a day before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
I told you! I told you!
Naturally, he tried to warn everyone of impending doom. In November of 1958, The Time Element premiered on Westinghouse Desilu Playhouse, and it was a hit. The Time Element was a tough sell, but producer Burt Granite and Desi Arnaz of I Love Lucy fame had Rod's back. Although Desi himself served as narrator for The Time Element, for the actual series a new narrator was required, and who better to narrate than Orson Welles? Well, as it turns out, Orson Welles' price tag was apparently too high, so Rod Serling stepped up to the plate. Despite being camera shy, he gave it a shot, and the rest is history. Rod knocked it out of the park.
This is The Twilight Zone.
Since The Time Element had already aired on Desilu Playhouse, a fresh pilot was required to get The Twilight Zone off and running. Inspired by a lonely walk on an empty studio set, Rod Serling wrote a new script, Where Is Everybody? A mysterious tale about an amnesiac who found himself all alone in an empty town. For 5 seasons, The Twilight Zone entertained viewers with thought-provoking and bizarre tales. Often there was a message in each story, and of course, there were the trademark twist endings. Rod wrote or adapted an astonishing 92 of the 156 episodes, and just as he set out to do from the beginning, many of his stories touched on the socially conscious issues he was previously restricted from writing about. Another topic he was able to tackle was war. Serling was an anti-war activist who had seen combat himself in the Philippines. Ultimately, his battle scars informed much of his work, and this was seen in episodes such as Purple Testament and Quality of Mercy. Rod couldn't have accomplished such a feat without the contributions of many other writers such as Charles Beaumont, Richard Matheson, George Clayton Johnson, and Montgomery Pittman, just to name a few. Among the most popular are episodes such as Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, It's a Good Life, The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, and of course, Time Enough at Last. Many stories also worked as psychological thrillers, drama, suspense, comedy, and horror. This wide range of stories meant there was pretty much something for everyone. If a creepy story about a living dummy wasn't your thing, then viewers could tune in the following week for one of the comedy episodes, which might feature Carol Burnett jumping through a window for a laugh. Speaking of which, The Twilight Zone was a hotspot for many up-and-coming actors whose careers would go on to span decades. There was Burgess Meredith, Vera Miles, Robert Redford, and many more. Despite the fact that the show was a critically acclaimed Emmy Award winner, none of that made up for other problems as far as the network was concerned. The show often went over budget, which is why in Season 2, there was a failed attempt to videotape episodes, a plan that was abandoned once the network concluded not enough was saved by shooting on video.
Room for one more, honey?
Also of note, The Twilight Zone never scored as highly in the ratings as you might expect. In fact, the show was even canceled more than once. Although the show elevated Rod Serling to legendary status and gave him the artistic freedom he long desired, his success came with a heavy price tag. Rod was totally burned out. It didn't help that the fourth season featured longer episodes as opposed to the standard shorter runtime from previous seasons. The fifth and final season did return to the original format, but by that point, Serling was truly done. For years, he'd fought hard to create engaging, high-quality television. However, for 5 seasons, Rod struggled with an overly demanding schedule, and in doing so, he neglected his mental and physical health, not to mention his family life. He survived on coffee, soda, and was rarely seen without a cigarette. By the end of season 5, Rod was sick of fighting for renewal, and he was through with dealing with budget cuts and sponsors. The battle was over. And the timing was no coincidence. By that point, television was forging ahead with lighter fare and playing it safe when it came to the sponsors. Following the end of The Twilight Zone, Rod Serling sold his rights to CBS. To most, he's finally remembered as the charismatic host and creator of The Twilight Zone. Today, his work is still as influential as ever, and his legacy lives on. The Twilight Zone, of course, lived on beyond Rod Serling, except the next time fans would enter the fifth dimension, it would be on the big screen. In 1983, The Twilight Zone was reinvented by Steven Spielberg and several other industry heavyweights. In order to capitalize on nostalgia for the classic series, 3 of the 4 segments were remakes. Burgess Meredith, who featured in 4 of the original series episodes, stepped into Rod's shoes as narrator. The all-star cast included Dan Aykroyd and Albert Brooks, who both popped in for a very memorable opening segment.
Did you ever watch The Twilight Zone?
The rest of the cast included Scatman Crothers, who starred a remake of the classic episode Kick the Can, a sentimental take which was directed by Steven Spielberg. Kathleen Quinlan and Jeremy Light starred in a remake of the classic episode It's a Good Life. Directed by Joe Dante, this was a retelling with some fresh twists and new monstrosities. Even the original actor, Bill Mumy, who played Anthony Fremont in the classic episode, showed up for a cameo. John Lithgow starred in a remake of the classic Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, and a role originally made famous by William Shatner. This decidedly more horror-fueled version was directed by George Miller of Mad Max fame. And lastly, Vic Morrow starred in a segment called Time Out, which was a slight rework of the classic episode Equality of Mercy. Morrow played a bigot who traveled through time, inhabiting the bodies of others who experienced racism and persecution himself. It was directed by John Landis. Sadly, this segment is mainly known for the horrific tragedy that came about during its production. Vic Morrow and 2 illegally hired child actors, 7-year-old Mika Din Lee and 6-year-old Renee Shin Yi Chen, were killed while filming a scene involving a stunt helicopter. Their deaths would lead to years of legal battles. John Landis and 4 other crew members were charged with involuntary manslaughter. Ultimately, all of them were acquitted. Understandably so, controversy surrounding the incident continues to this day, as the story still makes its rounds on the internet. The tragedy forced into action strict new safety measures and child labor laws. The Twilight Zone movie received mixed reviews, although it was a decent success financially. However, the horrific tragedy overshadowed the movie then, and continues to do so to this day. When The Twilight Zone did return to the small screen, times had changed. The 80s were in full swing, and Steven Spielberg, who had previously worked on a Twilight Zone movie, was forging ahead with his own NBC anthology series, Amazing Stories. So clearly anthologies were back in style. Along came competition in the form of the new Twilight Zone. The show aired for 3 seasons from 1985 to 1989 and had a total run of 65 episodes. Stepping in as narrator for Rod Serling was Charles Aidman, who appeared in 2 episodes of the original series. And a new version of the Twilight Zone theme was provided by the Grateful Dead. New talent such as J. Michael Straczynski and George R.R. Martin of Game of Thrones fame came on board. Stepping in to direct, heavyweights such as Wes Craven of A Nightmare on Elm Street and William Friedkin, who's best known for his work on The Exorcist. Among Twilight Zone fans, there are many favorite episodes such as Saturday, which featured a young Bruce Willis as a man who accidentally calls home and somehow ends up talking to a double of himself. Other favorites include episodes such as A Little Peace and Quiet, Shadow Man, Dealer's Choice, which featured Morgan Freeman, and Nightcrawlers, a dark story about a Vietnam War vet and the power of mind over matter.
I'm the grandma now.
And of course, I have to mention the Stephen King adaptation, Grandma, which was just pure nightmare fuel. Needless to say, the 80s series leaned in a lot heavier on the horror. The revival had a strong start, however, ratings began to dip early on. With that, CBS lost faith in the series, and the show was shuffled around in different time slots. Although it was renewed for a second season, it was put on hiatus after only a few weeks. Eventually, it was simply cancelled. A third season only came about because CBS needed to sell the show into syndication. 30 more episodes were produced on a strict budget to fulfill syndication requirements. Nowadays, there's more appreciation for the 80s Twilight Zone. Among fans, it's highly regarded. The revival was rarely predictable, and it had standout episodes.
James is sorry. James is sad. James is a rotten, lousy cat. James regrets. He missed your...
The next time viewers saw Twilight Zone on TV, it would be in the form of the 1994 CBS special, Twilight Zone, Rod Serling's Lost Classics.
From five-time Emmy Award winner Rod Serling come the last two tales of suspense.
This event featured two of Rod's unmade stories. The special was co-produced by Rod Serling's widow, Carol Serling. Most notably, The Lost Classics was narrated by none other than James Earl Jones. The first segment was called The Theater. It was adapted and scripted by Richard Matheson from Rod Serling's original outline. The tale starred Gary Cole and Amy Irving as a young woman who heads out to the movies to see a classic film, but ends up witnessing scenes from her own past and eventually her own future. The fan favorite of the TV special was a second segment titled Where the Dead Are. It starred Patrick Bergin and acting legend Jack Palance in a macabre story about a doctor who traveled to a mysterious island where the dead had been revived.
We're traveling to another dimension. A dimension not only of sight and sound.
The second full series revival of The Twilight Zone aired for one season on the UPN network and had 43 episodes from 2002 to 2003. This time, Forrest Whitaker stepped in as host. Whitaker is famous for roles in The Last King of Scotland, Bird, Platoon, and Star Wars Rogue One. For the 2000 series, the opening theme music was reworked yet again, this time by Jonathan Davis, singer of the band Korn. With The Twilight Zone now taking place post 9/11, the time was right to cover some fresh territory. By this time, terrorism was front and center on the minds of viewers. Episodes such as the remake of Monsters Are Due on Maple Street were given a new spin. The original symbolized McCarthyism, with anti-alien hysteria serving as an allegory for the anti-communist sentiment of that era. The remake, however, served as a commentary on the rising fear of terrorism. The show also delved into other contemporary matters such as sexuality, gender roles, gang violence, and stalking. Among Twilight Zone fans' favorite episodes include One Night at Mercy, Night Route, Dead Man's Eyes, and Evergreen. Also of note, Jeffrey Combs, who's most famous for his work in the horror film Reanimator, starred in A Placebo Effect, a story about a hypochondriac who believes he's caught a deadly disease from a sci-fi novel he just read. Probably the most famous episode of the 2000s is the sequel episode It's Still a Good Life, which followed up on a grown-up Anthony Fremont, as last seen in a classic show, Wishing People into the Cornfield. The sequel episode even reunited the original actor with Cloris Leachman, Anthony's mother, and they brought in Mummy's real-life daughter, Liliana Mummy. The early 2000s revival didn't fare well in terms of ratings or reviews. However, Twilight Zone fans do have fond memories of the show, and for many, it was a gateway into the fifth dimension. And that brings us to the third and final Twilight Zone revival to date, most commonly referred to as Jordan Peele's Reboot. This series was developed by Jordan Peele, Simon Kinberg, and Marco Ramirez. There are a total of 2 seasons and 20 episodes, which ran from 2019 to 2020. Ever since the earliest promos, it was pretty clear the revival would be headlined by Jordan Peele, who's best known for his critically acclaimed work in both the comedy and horror genre. Much of Peele's work has touched on topics such as race, class, and modern social issues of our day. And that brings us to his take on the fifth dimension. With Peele serving as executive producer and stepping in as narrator, the rest of the cast was rounded out by a crop of talented actors such as Adam Scott, Tracy Morgan, Kumail Nanjiani, Rhea Seehorn, and many others. The reboot was pretty different from previous incarnations of the series. For instance, instead of appearing weekly on television, the new series was only available via a paid streaming service, CBS All Access, which was eventually rebranded to Paramount+. The show was also now more mature, especially in terms of language, meaning casual swearing was now a thing in the fifth dimension. Although all other incarnations have certainly contained adult themes, for the most part, previous shows was still an all-ages affair and relatively family-friendly. Of all the revivals, this reboot is easily the one that has fans divided, with many being very vocal and critical of the series. Previous Twilight Zone incarnations used allegories to comment on controversial social issues. However, criticisms of the reboot often mention that the show was more heavy-handed in its approach to its messages and themes. On the other side, those who have favored the series have noted a few favorites, such as The Comedian, a story about a struggling young comic who discovers an unusual path to success. Another favorite for some fans is Blurry Man. This story starred Zazie Beetz, and a unique tale about a writer haunted by a mysterious figure referred to as the Blurry Man. One of the most popular episodes is You Might Also Like. This was an episode that both old and new fans were able to appreciate. Gretchen Mol starred as a mother in a bizarre dystopian society where everyone is eagerly preparing for the arrival of a mysterious egg. The obvious question being, what is the egg? In early 2021, it was announced that the reboot wouldn't be returning. However, this decision wasn't made by CBS, but by Peele's team itself. A statement was released which went as follows. We greatly enjoyed our time working on The Twilight Zone, particularly when the real world around us often felt more and more like another dimension. It went on to say, we cherish the opportunity to collaborate with so many talented writers, actors, and crew members. After 20 unique episodes, we have told the stories that we wanted to tell. It was Rod Serling's belief that television had a responsibility not only to entertain, but also to educate and enlighten. He certainly accomplished his vision through The Twilight Zone. Each iteration thereafter also tried to recapture the spirit of the classic, and move The Twilight Zone into the modern era. If history repeats itself, it's safe to say we'll see The Twilight Zone take shape again one day. I'll toss out one quick question. From the Twilight Zone series you have seen, which was your favorite and why? Feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Thank you for watching. Don't forget, hit that sub button. Our road to 1,000 continues. Until next time, stay safe, be well, and take care. Later.